Hello, everyone. We are now up to Chapter 7, Thinking, Language, and Intelligence. So in this chapter, we're going to define what thinking is. Hopefully at the end of this, you'll know several ways in which we try to represent information within our minds, be able to explain the differences between logic as well as natural concepts, identify and describe mental strategies so that we can be able to solve problems more efficiently or effectively. We'll also talk about how we can identify as well as describe those roadblocks that might come up that stops our ability to solve problems effectively, as well as stumping sometimes when we try to make a decision. Additionally, it's my hope that you'll be able to describe the basic processes when we're talking about creative thought and be able to explain the difference between divergent and convergent thinking. We'll apply skills of problem solving so that you know how to become a creative problem solver. Also looking at how to identify and describe those different facets to language, as well as the milestones in language development that's going to help in terms of looking at roles as like nature versus nurture, particularly when we're talking about language. Then, of course, we'll also try to assess how linguistic relativity, or the linguistic relativity hypothesis, as well as language, would be unique for us humans. All right, so my hope is that you'll also be able to define intelligence, identify different tests of intelligence, as well as be able to evaluate the characteristics of a good test of intelligence. Hopefully, you'll also be able to assess gender differences in terms of cognitive abilities, be able to describe and look at the characteristics of two extremes of intelligence, and as well as the misuses of some of the intelligence tests. Talk about the major theorists of intelligence and talk about how their roles has a play in heredity as well as environment and intelligence. Module 7.1 is going over thinking. So when we're talking about how we see things, or our mind's eye actually, we have to look at and recognize cognitive psychology. That's that part of psychology that actually looks specifically at how we perceive, the way we think, our ability to solve issues, times when we need to make decisions, as well as language. Now, of course, you have to have operational definitions. So in this case, thinking would be the process of mentally representing and manipulating information, meaning we have a way to twist it and turn it if we have to. Mental images allows us to be able to perform cognitive functions like remembering and directions and being able to create solutions to problems utilizing innovation and such. So more or less, I want you to envision or think about the route you might take, like if you're traveling home or you're going to the store, or what kind of mental images might go through your mind. Do you have any landmarks that you might use to remember how to get somewhere? These are those mental images that you might be using to get your brain to continue to function and see things. And as in the last chapter for memory, recognition tasks. You remember that, right? All right. So in order for us to have any thought process and understand those dynamics, you want to know these few terms. Concepts is when we're looking at mental categories, utilizing it for classification, such as for objects, events, or some ideas that we might have in our minds. that represents common features or particular similar properties. Now, there's two types of concepts. We have the logical concepts, which clearly defines our roles for membership, such as we know how specific our characteristics might be, and it's always going to be showing. And that helps us to define basic shapes. Then you have natural concepts, and these concepts, they're more poorly defined, and they have fuzzy rules for membership. Like looking at a fruit. Is it a pumpkin? Or is pumpkin considered to be a fruit? Hopefully that made sense. All right, well, let's see if it made sense to you. It's time for that activity check. Which of the following is an example of a logical concept? Would that be A, dogs, B, vegetables, C, snow, or D, triangle? Yes, I'm gonna do my favorite song. Do 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 do. Yeah, I know. Poorly did Jeopardy sound, but you get the meaning. And time is now up. So, what answer did you come up with? Well, if you said triangle, then you got it on the nose. The concept triangle, again, is to be able to describe any three-sided form or figure. So dogs, vegetables, as well as snow are more natural concepts, as they're all poorly defined concepts. Remember, this is logical means succinct, got a plan of action in place, right? So if you're looking at vegetables, for example, this includes things like green beans, carrots, beetroot, lettuce. There's nothing similar to the color, shape, texture, or size, and there's so many different types of vegetables. Hence, that means that this is more poorly defined in terms of concepts. All right, let's keep going. All right, so let's talk about some of these strategies we might utilize when we're solving problems. First and foremost, problem solving is basically what your brain does when it hits a challenge and says, all right, how do I fix this? More or less, it's a special kind of thinking, a thinking that focuses on finding the solution to a specific problem, whether that's figuring out a math equation or trying to find your lost keys, or even deciding what to eat when you're on a budget and everything in your refrigerator looks kind of suspicious on being spoiled. When we're talking about creating strategies for problem solving, there isn't just one way to solve problems. As humans, we have a whole plethora of tools that we can use. So some common strategies I just want to point out would be, first and foremost, trial and error. You keep trying different things until something finally works. So think of trying to open a locked door. You might start by jiggling every key on the ring until one finally turns the knob. That's not a fancy way of doing it, but sometimes it's more effective. Then the second thing might be insight, that aha moment. Now, this is when the solution suddenly clicks into place and like a light bulb is going off in your head. So maybe you've been staring at a crossword clue forever. It's like, and then suddenly, bam! You know, the answer just comes and appears to you. Now, the third thing we can consider is algorithms. This is more of a step-by-step guaranteed method to kind of get that right answer. So, more or less, if you follow the rules correctly, it should work, right? For an example, let's take a math formula like A equals pi squared. Now, there's an algorithm for finding that area, and every time you plug into the numbers correctly, you'll get the right answer. So algorithms are reliable, but they actually can be slow and very tedious. Then we have the heuristic. This is a mental shortcut where we look at rule of thumb. Now, understand, it doesn't guarantee the perfect answer, but it will save time and probably save some effort in the scheme of things. An example of this might be when you're grocery shopping and you might pick the middle price brand because you assume that it's a good quality but not too pricey. Now that's what we call a heuristic. It's a quick educated guess. Now in terms of algorithms equal precise recipes that'll always work if you follow them correctly. Heuristics are those quick little tips that usually will work, but that's not a guarantee. It might not work. Both ways are useful depending on the situation. So, like with algorithms, they're good when this accuracy matters, and heuristics is good for when we need to do it fast or in practicality when it matters the most at that point. There'll be times when we have these mental blocks, these roadblocks to when we're trying to solve an issue or a problem. And it's those barriers to problem solving. Think of it when our minds get in the way, its own way. Because even the best thinkers can get stuck sometimes. I know I do all the time. The brains really like shortcuts. And while those shortcuts can help, they also can trip us up. So let me just kind of break it down for you to see how some of these common barriers actually can create a mess when we're trying to do some problem solving. Let's first look at a mental set. This is when your brain is saying, well, this worked before, so let's just do that again. Because we naturally tend to rely on strategies that helped us in the past. It's like we put it in a folder and we say, okay, it's time to pull that out again. Now, it can be helpful when the problem is a similar one to the one we've already solved. However, it's not so great for new problems because it needs a different approach. You might use this as an example. You always start your computer when it freezes, right? And it usually works. But one day it didn't. So instead of exploring other solutions like trying to check your power issue or see if there might be a virus or software bug, you just keep hitting restart, stuck in that same mental groove. Yeah, and you find it's not working. All right, that was one barrier. Another one is functional fixedness. And this is a sneaky one, y'all. Functional fixedness happens when we see an object only in terms of its typical use. So it's like our creativity gets boxed in by habit. Think of a paperweight, okay? But you only think of the paperweight as a thing you buy in an office store like Staples. You completely overlook that your coffee mug sitting right next to you could do the same job as that paperwork weight just as effectively. Breaking out of functional fixedness means you're kind of asking, well, what else could this object be used for? That's how you would deal with it. Okay? Then we have irrelevant information. This is when our brains is just easily distracted by like the shiny details that really is not helping. And when we focus on wrong information, we kind of miss what really matters. So look at it like this. There's a word problem that says Sarah has 5 marbles, 7 blue marbles, and I'm sorry, let me go back and redo that. Sarah has 5 red marbles, 7 blue marbles, and a pet turtle named George. There we go. Got it. So you start wondering about George the turtle instead of focusing on the math itself of the marbles, right? That's that classic irrelevant info trap, because George ain't had nothing to do with them marbles. So just remember, when we're talking about a mental set, we're looking at old solutions for new problems, and sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. Also, with functional fixedness, it's seeing objects only for their usual purposes and not being able to go outside the box. In terms of irrelevant information, that's again getting distracted by details that really don't help solve a problem in the first place. Had nothing to do with it. It's just out there. So when you're overcoming these kind of barriers, remember you have to think openly, have some flexibility. You want to be questioning those assumptions and try to focus on what really matters, the core of the creative problem solving. And that's it in a nutshell, right? All right, let's move on. Decision making. Let's talk about how we're choosing our way through everyday life and we're making decisions. There could be some small things like, do I wear comfy shoes or the stylish ones, to big items like, what major should I choose for college? Or do I really need another steaming, streaming subscription? Ooh, that was a Freudian slip. Anyway, and if you don't know what that is, ask me and I'll tell you. But when we're talking about decision making, basically we're looking at a special kind of problem solving. Because instead of finding one solution, we're going to be choosing what's best from a set of possibilities. It's that mental version of being able to stand in front of a vending machine and trying to decide what snack you'll regret least later on. Like for me, I'm always choosing one or two things, or three things actually. I choose the peanut butter crackers. I might choose potato chips, but there'll always be something. And it's the one I would least regret, the one I think won't raise my blood sugar through the roof. Long story short, decision making as problem solving is just like problem solving. Decision making involves trying to identify the problem or goal, like what am I trying to decide? And then considering what options I might have. What are the choices? Then we'll go by weighing the pros and the cons. Like, what happens if I choose one? And then in choosing a course of actions, trying to evaluate what the result might be. Okay, did that really work or not so much? That's what you might think. So whether you're planning your next meal or your next career move, the steps are always going to be pretty similar. And just the stakes will be different. Now, we also have to talk about cognitive biases. That's when thinking plays tricks on us in our decision-making process. Because it isn't always rational. It's going to be full of these little mental shortcuts, like in blind spots that would be called cognitive biases. These are those patterns in thinking that can nudge us toward the wrong choice, even when we think we're being logical. So an example of this would be confirmation bias. Now with confirmation bias, this one is one of our biggest culprits that we can discuss, because it's the tendency to be able to look for, to notice, or to believe information that supports what we already think. Hence, we start ignoring evidence that contradicts it. Okay, so an example here might be, you believe your favorite celebrity is kind and humble and sweet, and then there's a video that surfaces showing them being rude to a waiter. However, instead of rethinking your belief, you say, oh, that was probably just him having a bad day. That's confirmation bias, because you're protecting the original belief even when new evidence disagrees with that assumption. So when we think about decision making, understand it equals choosing the best option among alternatives. It's a type of problem solving, however, it's focusing on selecting, not creating solutions. Cognitive biases like confirmation bias, it definitely can cloud our judgment because it's making us see what we want to see rather than what's really out there. So in that, I'll wrap up for looking at decision making roadblocks. What makes all this important anyway? When we're thinking about roadblocks in decision making, we got to look at heuristics. These are those helpful shortcuts that sometimes trip us up. Okay, so it's saying that our brains are amazing, but it's also a little lazy. What it does is save time and energy, and we often use heuristics as mental shortcuts or those rules of thumb that kind of help us to make quick decisions. Am I wearing my JSU football jersey even though it's going to be 90 degrees, or I'm going to just wear a t-shirt? That's what we would be trying to wonder. So heuristics actually can be super useful. However, you don't want to spend 30 minutes trying to decide which cereal to buy. But it can also lead to us making bad judgments or even creating stereotypes. Look at two common ones. Let me give them to you this way. The first one's being the representativeness heuristic. And this is when we'll make a judgment by comparing something or someone to what we think is going to be a typical example of a category. In other words, our brain says, well, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it probably is a duck. However, here's the problem. Sometimes appearances can fool us. Think of this. You see someone with colorful tattoos, wild hair, and a sketchbook under their arm. You instantly think, they must be an artist. But maybe they're actually an accountant who loves art on the weekends. This heuristic leads us to rely on stereotypes instead of the facts or the evidence. We'll assume a small sample, like one person, will represent an entire group, like all artists or accountants. So then you got the availability heuristic, and this one's all about what's easier to remember. If something pops into your mind quickly, then our brain assumes it must be common or it must be likely. An example here might be you just saw a commercial where there's a certain brand of ice cream 5 times a week. You saw it for 5 times this week. So when you're at the store, you turn around and buy that brand. Not because it's better, but because it's the one your brain remembers first. Now, another example could be if you see a lot of news stories about plane crashes, then you might start thinking flying is more dangerous than driving, even though data suggests otherwise. That's that availability heuristic at work, where your brain is judging probability based on what's most memorable, not what's most accurate. Now, what I want you to remember about all this is that heuristic saves time and mental energy. However, it really don't let you make your own decisions or make decisions for you. When you catch yourself making a snap judgment, pause and ask yourself, is this based on facts or just what the easiest thing is to think of? And I know that was a mouthful, but I hope you do understand. And if not, use that inbox, they'll send me a message. So now we got to talk about creativity, my favorite subject. and sometimes it's around. Now, box creativity isn't just for artists, musicians, or inventors. It's something we all can do. At its core, creativity means that use an original thought to come up with new and innovative and useful ideas, solutions, or products. And it's what happens when our brain says, wait, if we tried this instead. Whether you're designing a new app or trying to find a new shortcut to class, or even discovering that a hair tie will make a great Lay's potato chips chip clip. Now, that's creativity in action. So, next question would be, how do we go about measuring creativity? This is when we talk about divergent versus convergent thinking. And there's two major styles that we want to be dealing with, and that is, again, divergent and convergent. So with divergent thinking, this here is that creative kind of thinking, it's where that one would say, well, how many different ways could I look at this? Divergent thinking allows generating many possible ideas or uses for something, even the wild stuff. And it's open-ended, it's playful, it makes you smile, and you're full of those, well, what if I did this? Or maybe I could try this. So think of this example. If I asked you, well, what can you do with a paperclip? A divergent thinker might say, well, it holds papers together, it'll unlock a door, make jewelry, it might pick food out of your teeth, but ew, that's kind of nasty, but still creative. It'll turn into a tiny sculpture, this type of thinking that allows measure of creativity because it's about what? Flexibility and originality. Now, when there's convergent thinking involved, here we're looking at the total opposite, okay? This is when we're looking more logical, more focused, and it's going to be about trying to find the correct answer from all types of possibilities. It's what you use when you're solving a math problem, or following a recipe when you're cooking or baking, or even when you're answering a multiple choice question. So think of this scenario. What is 6 times 7? Well, that has only one right answer when we say 6 times 7, right? That's going to be 42. Now, what makes that creative? There's no creativity points awarded for saying, well, maybe it's the meaning of life. However, both of these are still important. Think of your brain like a creative duo. With divergent thinking, it helps you to explore those ideas. However, with convergent thinking, it allows you to decide which one actually works. So it works hand in hand together, and it makes innovation possible. You're allowed to brainstorm freely, and then it'll help you to narrow it down to the best, most practical option. Ain't that cool? It is. My question to you, are you tapping into your creative potential? How do the minds put it all together when we are thinking creatively? We're not just pulling ideas out of thin air. We're using a whole network of cognitive mental processes that helps us to be able to imagine, to be able to connect, and kind of make sense of the world we live in. So think of creativity like it's a recipe. It's not just one ingredient, but it's going to be a mixture of different thinking skills, different uh, workings that we put together to allow us to cook up something original. Here's some ingredients I want you to remember for creative thinking. The first one is mental imaging. And this is where you see things in your mind's eye. You'll be able to formulate mental images or representations of objects, events, or even ideas. And that's even if they're not right in front of you. So An example of this might be, well, okay, imagine your favorite beach, the waves, the sand, the sound of, the seagulls, you know. But that's mental imaging at work, okay? With creativity, this often starts here. And when we visualize new ideas before bringing them, you know, to life, we kind of work those through, which moves us into the next area, concept formation and concept. This is where we organize that formulation and into the world of our minds. We start to group objects, events, as well as ideas through shared features. So we don't really have to start from scratch or create the wheel again every time we encounter something new. This might look like this, where you see a new animal you've never met before, but it's small, it's furry, it meows. You're quickly going to group that with your mental concept of a cat, right? Even though it could be a bobcat, it could be a mountain lion, who knows? But this process helps creative thinkers to be able to recognize those patterns and then try to combine ideas in a clever way. The third thing we want to consider is problem solving in terms of the process of finding a solution to be able to challenge or look at any obstacle and work through it. It's what happens when you be able to hit that mental wall and ask yourself, okay, so can I make this work another way? In terms of when we are creative problem solving, this often involves being able to take risks, looking at testing ideas, as well as thinking beyond the obvious. Now, this example would show how we might be able to misplace or can't find a screwdriver, so you grab a coin instead and you improvise, right? That's creative problem solving in action. The fourth thing is to look at how decision making goes with ideas as well as solutions, that you need to be able to choose the best one that's available. Decision making, again, is that process of being able to select from two or more possible options. That meaning you've brainstormed three ways to be able to present yourself, your class project, for example, and now you decide which one fits your time, your materials, your audience, which one is going to be the best one, okay? With creative decision making, this is often going to blend logic with intuition. It's part art, part science. Now, creativity itself. Finally, we look at creativity and how it ties everything together. It's going to be that process of generating new workable ideas or products, something both original as well as useful. Creative thinking often uses three powerful tools. Okay, so let me give you this analogy, comparing one situation to another. Like my brain is like a computer, sometimes it just needs a reboot. Then there's the conceptual combination, merging two different ideas into one, like breakfast tacos, or smart watches, or eco bricks. Now let's look at conceptual expansion. Here we're looking at stretching an existing idea to new possibilities. What if classrooms were outdoors? Ooh, no work will ever get done if you ask me. All right, so I'm going to stop here and I will continue with part 2 that you'll probably receive for your assignment on online work for Monday. I want y'all to have a very safe and enjoyable weekend. Enjoy homecoming, have fun, let your hair down, chill, but be safe first and foremost. You do still have assignments due, and I need them done today. Your assignments will count as attendance for October 10th, 2025. So please make sure you do your assignments so you don't get marked absent. Thanks for listening. Have a great weekend, and we'll see each other next Wednesday. Peace.